So my name's Emily Mokros. I'm one of the organizers of the History Department workshop for this semester. Amy Malventano is one of my other co-conspirators. Karen Patron couldn't be here because she's presenting her own paper right now, and so she sends her regrets. Today, we're going to have a presentation circling around a paper, a work in progress by Allen Fletcher, with some comments by Dr. Kathy Newfont. And I'd like to introduce both of our featured speakers first, and then after each of them speaks, we'll turn things over to questions and conversation. If you want to submit questions throughout the talks in the Q&A or in the chat function, I'll keep track of them. So by all means do so, or you can wait till the Q&A and use the raise hand function and have a general discussion. So Allen Fletcher, our author today, is a PhD student in the history department at the University of Kentucky. He works with David Hamilton. He recently received his MA after defending his thesis, Patronage Politics in Eastern Kentucky, the Turner Family of Breathitt County. Prior to this, he received his BA degree from Transylvania University. His essay today, titled Marie Turner and the Politics of Education in Breathitt County, Kentucky, is going to be published in a volume by the Jesse Stewart Foundation on Southeastern Kentucky next fall. And so he's asking for our feedback on this. And our discussant today is Dr. Kathy Newfont, an associate professor in the history department at the University of Kentucky and a member of the Appalachian Center and Environmental and Sustainability Studies programs, and author of Blue Ridge Commons, Environmental Activism and Forest History in Western North Carolina, which won the Weatherford Award from the Appalachian Studies Association, among other honors. So I'm going to turn it over to Allen, who's going to give us a brief introduction, and then we're going to hear from Kathy for some comments, and then we'll have a general discussion. While you're listening to these presentations, just try to keep yourself on mute so that we don't have any interference, and then we'll open things up later on.
Thank you, Dr. Mokros, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here today. So as was previously mentioned, this is an essay derived from my master's thesis that I completed over the summer, and I've adapted my chapter on the 1930s and the New Deal to the essay that you have seen and read, or maybe you haven't read, that's okay too. And so I think this is a good chance for me to talk about my work, which I think is always helpful, and to get some helpful feedback, because I have a couple months left to make some revisions and edits, which I intend to do. So I've got a brief PowerPoint that I can share. And so we are talking about Marie R. Turner and the politics of education in Breathitt County, which you can see is highlighted there in red. And so Marie Turner was a superintendent from this poor and isolated mountain county who over time earned her place as a respected educator and politician. And I think it's necessary to give a little bit of background on Breathitt County just to situate her. And so really throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, Breathitt County had earned this place, had earned a reputation for being a violent place, bloody Breathitt. And so, Appalachia in general has been associated with feuding and violence in a lot of ways. And a lot of times these feuds were depicted as sort of petty or familial, or they were rooted in hillbilly culture. And in Breathitt County, a lot of this feuding actually stemmed from political disputes and disagreements that had gone back to the Civil War. Breathitt County had been a mostly Confederate county, which set it apart from most of eastern Kentucky, which had been primarily a Union county. But over time, the late 19th century, early 20th century, we start to see these sensationalist, kind of romanticized images of the feud. And Breathitt County gained a lot of attention, even if this wasn't necessarily the whole story. So, needless to say, by the time Marie Turner comes in 1931, Breathitt County had earned a state reputation and a national reputation for being this really violent place. So she had a tall order on her hands, to say the least. And I make the argument that she practiced the politics of education. And so during this time, during the 1930s and before this, we see that politics and education often went hand in hand. The office of superintendent was inherently a political job, according to Kentucky law, because superintendents were elected by their school board members. And so, by nature, a lot of superintendents had to do some politicking. And this was Marie Turner's territory because she came from a political family. She was very interested in politics, and she was, more than anything, a very staunch Democrat. And so she's coming into office in 1931, and a couple years later, we see the New Deal making its presence after FDR was elected in 32. And so Marie Turner is really harnessing the power of the New Deal to not only improve infrastructure in her county, but also modernize her county and improve its reputation. So on the one hand, the New Deal did some good things. It was beneficial for roads and schools, and that was something she was very interested in. And you can see here a couple of pictures of her, which I think is helpful. And so she is harnessing the New Deal to build Breathitt County. And so on the one hand, it's a good thing. But on the other hand, she also gained a reputation in some circles for being corrupt, for combining politics and education in some kind of harsh ways. And so, it's also, I think, important to consider gender here as an important way of viewing Marie Turner and the work that she was doing. So, she was a superintendent at a time when not many women were superintendents in Kentucky. In the 1930s, when she took office, there were less than 10. And so, this in a lot of ways allowed her to distance herself from some of the dirty politics of the era. And it's also worth mentioning that her husband, too, was a very prominent politician. He was a state senator. Later, he would become a judge. And so, having him there sort of softened the political edge for her. And in addition, she was an educator, and she saw herself as an educator. That's how she advertised herself. Although, it's pretty clear that she was a politician and had politics in mind. But she stayed an educator for 38 years as superintendent. And so this was a socially acceptable role for women. And allowed her to distance herself from politics in some ways that men could not. And so I mentioned, throughout the paper that she was a very forward thinking in her outlook. She was carrying on this legacy of progressivism. She was experimenting with new and innovative curriculum. She was, implementing all of these guidance programs, and she was not afraid of consulting outsiders. She was always looking outside to bring in as many resources as she could, whether it was, money from the federal government or whether it was people. And, she produced a lot of positive publicity for the county. especially in the late 1930s. She brought the first lady to the county. Marion Post, who was a photographer for a New Deal agency, came to Breathitt County and spent some time there. And we also see the Federal Writers Project, which was a New Deal agency, publish a book on Breathitt County, which was pretty irregular, given that Breathitt County was pretty small and it was pretty isolated. And a lot of this goes back to Marie Turner and the advocacy that she was making for her county. And, you know, I've included some pictures here just because I like pictures and I think they're good for putting names to faces. And so these are all photos taken by Marion Post of classrooms, or on the right, you can see a picture of Marie Turner talking with an art teacher who she brought in from Cincinnati. So that's another example of ways that she was, you know, really trying to expand beyond the reaches of Breathitt County. And, you know, some other pictures I think that just really highlight the importance of the work that she was doing. You know, roads and schools are good, they're important, but especially in a place like Breathitt County where a lot of these roads just simply did not exist. You know, you can see the two children there walking home from school, or someone riding a horseback through a creek bed. And so this is you know, something that she was up against. And, you know, my final slide here is just a picture of some of these consolidated schools that she was pushing for. So the county, which was pretty large geographically, had over 100 one-room schools, and she tries to consolidate as many of them as she can and build these modern consolidated schools like you see here. And the New Deal went a long way in helping her realize a lot of these ambitions. So, you know, the article pretty much stops in 1940. I give you just a little bit of a preview of what goes on in her later career, and she had a very long career, 38 years, and I really only talk about the first 8 or 9 years, but they were important years because they were her formative years. And, you know, especially during the 1930s, the educational system makes progress in spite of a Great Depression. And I think you see a lot of work being done to distance Breathitt County from these images of bloody Breathitt that had kind of loomed over the county for so long. And that's something that she was really interested in. And she would continue to do that throughout her later years. She continued cultivating political connections, whether it was with congressmen or senators or governors. And she would really do that until she retired in 1969. And then even after that, she would become more involved in state Democratic politics. So she was a lifelong Democrat. And she was working within this time period from about 1930 to 1970 that really fell within this New Deal liberal kind of purview. This is a time when, you know, we had a slew of Democratic presidents. We only had one Republican between 32 and 68. And same thing for Kentucky governors, which had been heavily Democratic and remained Democratic. So it was a good time to be a Democrat. And we see Marie Turner, you know, working the political system and the educational system to better Breathitt County. So, you know, I will leave it there because I want to get on to Dr. Newfont's questions and we can talk more, but I will go ahead and pass it off to you, Dr. Newfont.
Thank you, Alan. Can you all hear me? I sometimes have trouble when my mute is unmuted. Yes, okay, good, thank you. So first of all, I want to thank Alan for this paper. I found it really interesting, and it was a pleasure for me to read it. I saw some of Alan's very early work on this topic several semesters ago when he was just getting started on Marie Turner and the Turner family political story that he developed into his master's thesis. And so it's exciting for me to see it at this stage of the work when it's come such a long way, and it has gotten more elaborate and sophisticated. So I really enjoyed that. And I also want to congratulate Allen on the invitation to publish this. That's very exciting. And we don't have nearly enough work on the New Deal era politics in the Appalachian region, especially local politics. So it's great to have this addition to that literature. And Marie Turner also is a complicated and fascinating figure. And I see this work as being able to contribute to a number of kinds of studies. There's New Deal history, Appalachian history, Kentucky history, and frankly, I think the history of women in politics. Allen alluded to that, to the gender dimensions of that, which I think are important. We actually don't have nearly enough studies of Appalachian women in politics. And while a career like Marie Turner's was rare, women did play important roles in Appalachian politics that really Allen is kind of on the forefront of helping us find for the early and mid 20th century. So it's exciting to see the work take shape and make contributions in those ways. And of course, I see a lot of resonance. I'm really happy to see that Carson Ben is here and Abby Stevens, because Allen, I see resonance here with both of their projects, and they may have some thoughts. And then, of course, Dr. Gone's work too, when Marie Turner throws a leg over a horse and goes riding off. That definitely made me think of the Frontier Nursing Service as well. So I'm excited that they're here and looking forward to their comments as well. I'm gonna focus on 4 points in particular. One is Turner's role as a successful woman in politics, as you mentioned, Allen, in an era and a region where really there are significant barriers to that kind of success. And so I'm really interested in her ability to work in the male realm of politics, which I gather she does largely in partnership with her husband. I can't tell how much independent political work she's doing and how much they're functioning as a power couple. And she's doing most of the male political realm through him. I'd be interested in teasing that out a bit more. But I'm also really struck by her ability to leverage women's political networks and to really powerful allies, including the First Lady, obviously, Eleanor Roosevelt, but also Ori Latham Hatcher and Marion Post in this New Deal era, and then later Lady Bird Johnson as we get into the later era of your work. So this ability to move in women's political networks and to use those networks to turn those to her purposes, I think is really important and valuable. And I'd encourage you to highlight the ways that she is doing that. I'm interested in this idea of politics of education, and which is related to that, and a little more explication of that would be helpful for me as a reader who's unfamiliar with that term. So I gather it comes from Rebecca Montgomery, and I'm wondering whether it's a term referring to women's gendered political work in educational arenas specifically, because of course women did do a lot of work in the educational arena. It was one of the ones that was available to women when many others were closed. Or is it a more general term for women's and men's both work, like in the educational politics realm? So I have a question about that. So that's my first sort of cluster of points, is about her role as a woman in politics, and really to encourage you to continue developing a gendered analysis of that role and how she both deploys gender strategically, which I think she definitely does, and also how she manages the limitations of gender, which I think she also does, and how she manages to move in a male-dominated political world and so successfully for so long. So a second point that I want to raise is about this. I think this is a very fascinating story of image making, among other things. And I'm really struck by the ways this story is in conversation, as you mentioned, with T.R.C. Hutton's work on Bloody Breathitt in an earlier era. You mentioned it at the end of the paper, and you brought up Bloody Breathitt, of course, today. And of course, Hutton, as you noted, finds that what was depicted as, quote, feud violence near the turn of the 20th century was actually political violence and racialized political violence in Breathitt County, and that the term feud was deliberately used to mask that reality of racialized political violence. In fact, what was going on, according to Hutton, in Breathitt County was something very akin to what was going on in other parts of the South, where racialized political violence was reestablishing the Democratic Party, essentially, as the party of white supremacy, among other things. And so Hutton suggests that the roots of the Democratic Kingdom, if we use Ireland's term in Breathitt, which Turner inherits and continues, lay in that era and its political violence. So for me, this raises several questions, but one is, how much might Turner have known about that era and that history? And how much might her eagerness to move past the bloody Breathitt imagery have to do with, I don't know, maybe not to look too closely at the roots of her family's own rise to power, right? And there was violence on both sides. It's not the Democrats in Breathitt County had the lock on violence. They did not, but they emerged triumphant from this violent struggle in Hutton's telling, and that's the roots of as Allen mentions in his paper. Breathitt was surrounded by Republican counties, was unusual in being a Democratic county. So I think that's interesting, and also, what do we make of the fact that Breathitt's position as a solidly Democratic county in this sea of Republican counties, which again, Hutton attributes to this history of political violence, racialized political violence. So what do we make of the fact that that situated Turner especially well to capitalize on these New Deal opportunities that were made available in a Democratic administration? So this almost anomalous history, as you said, a kind of a very pro-Confederate county in an area that largely that was not the case, and then a highly Democratic county in an area that was not typically the case, positions Breathitt especially well to draw these New Deal dollars, which Marie Turner obviously does so effectively. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in her image making emphasis and the way you talk a little bit about that, but you don't foreground the way, like, she has, in my mind, at least 3 strategies that she very effectively deploys in the New Deal to remake Breathitt's image. One is the First Lady's talk that you open the paper with. Another is the Marion Post invitation and all those images that come out of that, which she, of course, we can't take those at face value because Marie Turner, as her host, is showing her the parts of Breathitt that she wants photographed, and no doubt is avoiding other parts that she doesn't want photographed. And that's, I completely agree that's incredible cache of resources for you. And I really encourage you to, as you move forward with this work, Allen, to really dive into the Marion Post photographs with a critical mind, but also it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Turner is kind of curating that image making for us, which is on the one hand problematic because it gives us a view that she has ensured. On the other hand, given the long history of people coming from outside the region and creating images without any input from local people, it's actually important that in this case, we do have local input, even if it is coming through one particularly powerful person. So I think that's interesting. And it gets back to the women in politics. The third way that she uses New Deal dollars to remake Breathitt's image is through the book, as you mentioned also in the paper. And so I think the political image making that she is so keen on doing is a really fascinating part of this work. And I don't know how much of that you can go into in this article, Allen, but as you move forward with the work, I really encourage you to develop that as well. So my third large point is basically about race. It seems strangely absent here, particularly given Hutton's emphasis on the racialized violence that is in the political past that Marie Turner inherits. And so presumably she presided over a segregated school system. And I'm wondering how many Black students Breathitt schools served. And I don't know the history of Breathitt well enough to know. I mean, counties have different histories this way. Corbin, for instance, violently in 1919. kind of drove out most of its Black population. And so as a result, there was such a small Black population there. I don't actually know what happened in terms of schooling to the remaining tiny population there. But Breathitt presumably had a Black population, at least if they drove them out at gunpoint. That's not a history that's known. There was racialized violence in Hutton, but he doesn't leave the county bereft entirely of a Black population. In North Carolina, I'm interested, she's consolidating schools, Marie Turner, and she is, at the end of her tenure, you mentioned there are only 2 of the one-room schoolhouses left. I know of an instance in Western North Carolina where a similar countywide school consolidation occurred, and the only one-room schoolhouse left in the county by the 1950s was the only Black school. So I don't know if there's a racial story behind those 2 that are left or not. That would be an interesting question. I also know of a Western North Carolina case where during the same time period, toward the end of your time period, not the period you address here in the New Deal, but later on, during the same period that Turner is superintendent, the local PTA in this Western North Carolina county organized across all the schools, and they actually did battle with the state PTA, which wanted to exclude the local Black school. They didn't want the Black school as part of the county PTA. And so that, again, demonstrates that I'd just be interested in what the racial dimensions of this story are. And if you have run across a Black population in Breathitt, which the education system must have served. So my fourth arena is basically, what about coal? Right? What's the coal story here? You mentioned that Breathitt struggled to afford roads and schools, and often counties found themselves in that position, as I know you know, because coal and timber companies typically controlled a great deal of land and of course produced a great deal of wealth, but often paid only paltry taxes. And so coal interests also have been tightly intertwined in politics in coal-bearing areas, as Breathitt, of course, is. And so I'm really curious about, is that the case there? Is coal tightly intertwined into Marie Turner's political story? Because it certainly would not surprise one to find that someone who had held power for that long, had connections to the coal industry that helped that. And so that would be an interesting point too. So I have lots of other ideas and comments, but those 4 areas seem to me particularly interesting, and I'll leave it at that and turn it over to the larger, turn it over to Allen, I guess, if you want to respond to any of that, or turn it over for questions, however you all want to handle that.
I can say a little bit about your last point, because I think it's an important one just for setting sort of context. And it's something that I really didn't do much of in the article. So, in comparison to other Eastern Kentucky counties, Breathitt County was near the bottom in terms of coal production. In 1930, I think it was certainly within the bottom quarter. It had a good coal industry, but nowhere near, a Harlan or a Pike County or anything like that. Most of its wealth had come from the timber industry that basically by 1920 had been depleted. So it goes, it fits nicely with Harry Cottle's assessment that, you've got all these extractive resources coming out and nothing is being restored. So, in terms of the economic possibilities, Breathitt County was at a pretty severe disadvantage. And to your second point about Marie Turner and her affiliation with the coal industry, we see this especially in her later years. Her husband was notorious for buying up properties in Breathitt County and around Eastern Kentucky that were known to have pretty significant coal deposits. They got very wealthy off of it. And especially after her husband would become judge, there were a lot of allegations that, he would do some pretty less than fair trade-offs within the court system. And so they did earn some pretty significant profits from coal, especially as we get into the 1960s and 70s when the coal industry starts to really tick back up Um, but as far as Breathitt County during the Depression, not much of a coal industry. And so that's one of the reasons that it, like other counties, it was struggling, but the county certainly couldn't rely on coal in ways that other places did. And the timber was mostly gone, at least the good timber. The Mowbray Robinson Company had clear cut thousands of acres by 1920.
Yeah, that is typical. And those timbered out regions did have very little to fall back on. So the quote that you used from I think it was from the book that came out that said it's, had all these resources extracted and nothing really given back. So it does underscore the tall order that she's up against, not only in terms of the image making that she's trying to do, but also in terms of the economics of the county and its school system. And it is a remarkable story that she is able, as you say, to build the educational infrastructure to the degree that she does during the Depression in a county whose economic base has, sort of peaked earlier when timber was and coal, and then coal's going to come back later, but that it's in between rounds of things that people point to as sources of economic development. I put a big question mark around that, around timber and coal. I mean, they often leave more problems behind than they than they address.
So I think the floor is open for questions. Certainly, I'm learning a lot from listening to both Alan and Kathy talk about this. I learned a lot from the paper. And so encouraging folks to raise their hand or jump in. Maybe I'll just ask a question, Alan, to start, which is about the boundaries of influence here, given that her husband is in the state legislature, right, and is working beyond Breathitt County, and that his, as you were just mentioning, his economic operations are working also. Oh, I'm sorry. Abby? Did you raise your hand? I'll call on you next. I'm sorry, I didn't see. So his economic operations are moving elsewhere in the state as well. And so I'm curious about her projects, these projects of the progressive schooling and the kind of alterations to the curriculum that are happening. Are those being emulated in surrounding counties? Is there any type of modeling that's happening in terms of influence of the educational projects going on?
Yeah, and this is where I think it's important to think of her as sort of carrying on this progressive legacy, because especially in Eastern Kentucky, at about the turn of the 20th century, we see a lot of settlement schools popping up in Eastern Kentucky. One of the better known ones was in neighboring Knott County, the Hindman Settlement School, run by two progressive reformers who came to the county, and they were interested in educational and moral and cultural uplift. So they were doing good work. Now historians have sort of complicated this narrative a little bit, saying that sometimes they bought into these cultural stereotypes and disrupted mountain culture in a lot of ways. So there's a little bit of disagreement on that. But Marie Turner is buying into a lot of these ideas and making connections with people. So whether it's Ori Hatcher, who was with the Southern Women's Educational Alliance, or whether it's Glenn Morris, who was at the Pine Mountain Settlement School, another well-known one in Harlan County. And so what's setting her apart is that she's a native of the region. And so she did have a stake, and I think a genuine interest in really wanting to improve the county and improve its image. And she's very much aware of these regional and national movements that are happening. You know, we see it with her making connections with the people I've listed, but she also does a lot of traveling. She was always going to, you know, conferences across the nation. She went to Cleveland, Ohio, was kind of seemed to be a favorite of hers, to attend these conferences. And so, you know, we can see her as part of this larger, you know, progressive movement, or the legacy of progressivism. Now, you know, of course, the progressive movement is big and complicated, and I think I mentioned in the paper that, you know, not everyone bought into every part of it, but I certainly see some of those. I certainly see Turner embodying some of those progressive ideals, particularly, you know, just a sense of optimism, the capacity for the federal government or any government to produce positive change. I definitely see a lot of that.
Thanks. Abby, and then Carson after Abby.
Talk a lot about political patronage, and I wonder if you consider Marie Turner to have had kind of a formal political machine, and if so, what that looked like.
The answer is a definite yes, and this is something that that is at the heart of my MA thesis. That the Turner family practiced patronage politics. They practiced clientele politics. So Marie Turner and her husband were in, you know, good positions to be stewards of patronage, because the school system employed more people in the county than everyone else. So she could use her position as superintendent to hand out jobs. And she did in many cases. And especially her husband, who was in the state Senate at the time, but later he would return to Breathitt County as a judge. And so his realm was more of the courthouse politics. But you know, they handed out jobs, and in return they expected political loyalty. And if you weren't loyal to the Turners, sometimes the consequences could be pretty harsh. You know, there's really these two competing sides to Marie Turner that I think makes her such a complex figure.
Yeah, there was that, I can't remember what the term they used for it, but basically sending somebody out to the edges of the county so that they had to move their families if they disagreed with her. That kind of not just reward, but punishment.
Yeah, there were several accusations of that too, that if you, you know, and she had her eyes and ears throughout the entire county, you know, gauging people's political sentiments. And so she had a good handle on what was going in the county, and it was pretty common. You know, she would approach someone and say, well, you know, I really don't like the way your family voted in the past election, or something like that. And that could be a game changer. And as you mentioned, some people could be sent to really remote parts of the county. And Breathitt County was huge to begin with, but especially in the 1930s, when there's not much of an infrastructure, I mean, it's basically amounted to a firing for some people.
Next, we have Carson. Ben?
Really enjoyed it, Alan. Abby kind of got to where I was thinking I'd want to go, because I'm interested. You sort of start out with this introduction talking about how she's a matriarch and took advantage of these sort of kinship networks. And you see a little of that with her relationship with her husband, obviously, kind of giving her access to different areas of power. But I wonder if you could talk some about some of these kinship networks in other parts of your thesis, maybe some things that might have given her or her husband an advantage prior to this period, or maybe something afterwards. I was just curious because, I don't know, seeing her described as a matriarch, I was wondering if there was maybe some other things aside from maybe education funding or political patronage in the 1930s that you might be able to add to this, might give it a little bit more perspective of Breathitt County in general. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so that, you know, this idea of a matriarch is something that comes up more in her later years, especially after she retires, she becomes known as kind of the matriarch of the Democratic Party. She would chair the state party in the 1970s. And so, in the 1930s, I think I'll definitely admit that I think that, the idea of a political matriarch might be harder to make that argument. But, one of the things that enabled them to harness people's political, to harness their political support was the fact that they came from different parts of the county, which is very important for building coalitions. She was actually from neighboring Knott County, but they moved to Breathitt County when she was pretty young. And her husband already came from a well-established political family. They were part of the elites already. And so when she marries, her husband, she becomes part of that. And, I don't want to, suggest that all of her power or everything that she became solely depended upon her husband, because I don't think that's the case at all, because I think it's helpful to view the two of them as a partnership, and they performed very different roles. Like I said, her husband was more the kind of backdoor politician. He liked to stay behind the scenes a little bit. And then Marie was obviously an educator, but she was the she was the one that sold these political ideas to the public. She was a very social person. She was the one getting out on the front lines and really making the case, which is, I think, what makes her the more interesting figure. And so, going back to this idea of the matriarch, a lot of people viewed her as the matriarch of the family. And well, I mean, she was the matriarch of the family. But she generally took a more public role than her husband, even in Breathitt County. She earned all of these kind of nicknames as Miss Marie or Marie R. She enjoyed the politicking and the public aspect of politicking. I would say much more so than her husband.
Well, can I jump in here? So I think that's a really interesting point that because so often Appalachian women were, well, I've come across a leading from behind model of Appalachian women's leadership rather than be out front. That it was more accepted if women were quietly doing a lot of the behind the scenes organizing work and that sort of thing, and then men were more likely to be the in front of the crowd spokesperson. And so she's really interesting in that way too, that she is the one who is more public, is getting out there and being the public face of this power couple. And I think your point about there being from different parts of the county is an interesting one too, because so they're from different parts of the county. They're obviously a man and a woman. They're different that way. And they're almost a different generation from each other too. I mean, not quite. He's not wildly older than she is, but enough older that would make a difference as well, perhaps. So I don't know how much all of that played into their ability to govern the county, essentially run the county the way they did for as long as they did.
Yeah, I think that's part of their longevity, is that they were, together. Obviously they were married and they were working in tandem with one another, but they performed very different roles and independent roles in a lot of ways. And, your point about Marie Turner being kind of ahead of the curve in terms of gender norms, I think it's worth, pointing out that she challenged gender norms in a lot of ways. She was an educational reformer and an activist. She was a woman in a place of power, and she was actively involved in politics, which, as you mentioned, there were a lot of barriers for women at that time. But she also stayed within kind of these gender norms, because she was an educator for 38 years, and that's how she that's how she sold herself, and that's how she said she wanted to be remembered. Now, again, I think that gets into sort of the image making, because a lot of outsiders did not see her as an educator. They thought of her as a politician. But she was asked on, a couple of occasions to run for political office, particularly state superintendent of public instruction for Kentucky, and she repeatedly turned it down. She said she wanted to stay in Breathitt County and continue to be superintendent.
Joe?
Thank you, Alan, for this paper. I really enjoyed reading it and learning a little bit more about Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky in particular. And also thank you for the conversation so far. I wanted to ask you a question about her curricular ideology, because there are a few times in the paper when you bring up curriculum, and it's clear that she has a desire to impose a different kind of curriculum than the state of Kentucky more broadly is adopting. And she has really kind of defined views about what should be taught in schools. And I was kind of wondering if there's a way you could emphasize that, or maybe scrutinize it a little bit more, to kind of connect it to her political ideology overall, as a way that she's trying to kind of shape the county going forward, not just in terms of building education, but particular kinds of education within the county. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, as I allude to some places in the paper, she was really challenging the existing curriculum. So she was, attracting these people and offering these classes that weren't necessarily available in other parts of Appalachia, whether it was home economics or art classes or music classes. And she also created a pretty vocational program, for agriculture or carpentry or mechanical work. And so she was a big believer in letting students choose their own path. And she even did this into the 1960s, which is another conversation. But she said we need to suit curriculum to the needs of the student. And so one of the things that she did was she kind of broke the rules a little bit. She did not require geometry in the high school math curriculum. She said, I don't see why students need geometry if they want to stay in Breathitt County and be a farmer or be a carpenter. And so, some people might disagree with that, but she allowed students a great deal of, flexibility. And so she was looking toward the future in that way. And also realizing that for a lot of these students, they would probably never leave Breathitt County for their entire lives, or they would be staying there. And so she was aware of that, and I think wanted to, create this adaptable school system, even if it meant breaking some of the state rules. I'm sorry, I think you had a second part to your question too that I think I'm.
Well, so that's it. I think that a lot of that comes through the paper in interesting ways. So one of the things I was thinking of when I'm formulating it is that you kind of characterize this very local story, like a lot of detail in this local story, as and her networks, her patronage networks, as being kind of emblematic of this region of Kentucky more broadly, but then also connected to a broader national narrative about New Deal politics. And so I'm just kind of curious, in terms of typicality and exceptionality, she's building kind of a very exceptional curriculum in the schoolhouse, is what it sounds like. So are there ways that this is less of an emblematic story about the functioning of patronage networks and more of kind of like a story about exceptionality and imposing really kind of engaging with national political developments and movements and trying to harness them in a local sense that is distinctive from a regional kind of a regional tradition or whatever you might call it.
Yeah, and I think Breathitt County was an exceptional case, like you mentioned. And one of the things that she expressed throughout her life is she grew very frustrated with Kentucky's educational policies. because Kentucky frequently ranked among the bottom states in the nation in terms of education, really from the 20s up to about 1960, when things started to get a little bit better. And so, she frequently said that I just wanted to circumvent, state policies or state governments and seek, help elsewhere, whether it was from the federal government or whether it was from these other organizations that I mentioned in the paper. She was not afraid of causing kind of a stir with her educational policies. And she garnered some criticism for it, especially in her later years. But, she was one of these people who, said, this is what I think is best for Breathitt County, and I'm going to do it.
Thank you.
Bill, sorry.
Thanks. Alan, thank you so much. I really enjoyed reading your draft and learning something about Marie Turner, whom I knew nothing about. I was really intrigued. This is going back a little bit to some observations that Kathy made early on, but her relationship with her husband, and I thought of that too. With the bookending, I think you can have maybe more fun with the bookending visits of the two first ladies, because they're part of really interesting sort of democratic New Deal, Great Society political partnerships in their own right. In talking about Eleanor Roosevelt on the one side and Lady Bird Johnson on the other. And so far as I can make out, it seems like Lady Bird's really cultivated she enabled her husband's political career in a billion different kinds of ways, but was almost dramatically self-effacing about it. And then you have a completely different sort of political partnership between FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, where they're really kind of operating in different spheres. And I'm just wondering where this sort of the Breathitt County power couple come in this way. Something that's interesting to me about Marie Turner is that she has an institutional base for her power, which obviously makes the kind of power that she wields rather different. And she seems to have a sort of LBJ streak in her, because one of the broader takeaways I got from this draft was that, part of her philosophy was that you have to break a lot of eggs to make an omelet. And she wasn't afraid to use political sharp elbows to try to get what she wanted, and would consign people who stood in her way to the outer darkness, or at least the outermost corners of the county. So I would just encourage you to think about that a little bit, because I think I'm just intrigued by the kind of model of female power and authority that in this particular era that she seems to embody, and how that's related to her relationship with her husband, who I know in this draft kind of stays in the shadows, and I get why that isn't like at the forefront of what you're saying here, but it's interesting to me.
Oh, thank you. That's something I think that was in the back of my mind, but now that you've said it, I think especially the comparisons between Eleanor Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was transforming the role of the First Lady, and especially during and after her husband's presidency, she was getting involved in her own, political or humanitarian campaigns, and she was breaking, from her husband in some ways. And we see that with Marie Turner too. She was not afraid to challenge her husband. And apparently they got into some pretty heated disputes about politics and educational politics, especially whenever he was in the state Senate, because, she could kind of gauge what was going on by virtue of him being in the Senate, but sometimes he didn't agree with her policies. And I think I mentioned this in the book, that sometimes she would enlist her teachers to write these letters to her husband, to try to prod him in a different direction. So she wasn't afraid to go around her husband in some ways, which I think makes their relationship even more complex, but more interesting.
So we have a question from Luke Victor. Luke, did you want to just go ahead and ask your question? Or I'll go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I can ask it. I've got a toddler here that might make some noise. But I was wondering, basically on two fronts. One is we have these national and local stories, but I'm really wondering about Breathitt County fitting into the state. So you've already talked a little bit about how it's kind of different, but this relationship to, you know, politics on a local level and the national level, but where it's kind of fitting into that state story, I think would be interesting. Specifically, I'm really wondering about how it compares with the other surrounding counties and how it relates to state politics. You know, compared, let's say, you know, you say Breathitt County is kind of exceptional in certain ways, but if there's a neighboring county that leans a little bit more Republican, how are those patronage things kind of playing out on a state level, as opposed to just this national kind of New Deal story you've been telling?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that Breathitt County was exceptional in that it was a majority Democratic county, and it was surrounded by a lot of Republican counties. And, you know, especially the time between 1930 and 1970, Kentucky politics was overwhelmingly Democratic. And Marie Turner and her husband were allying themselves with a lot of these Democratic politicians, especially Barkley, Fred Vinson, whenever he was serving in Congress and later in the Senate. Irvin Turner would have a very close relationship with Earl Clements, who would be governor in the late 40s, later Burt Combs. So, you know, it was a good time to be a Democrat. And it's worth noting that the Kentucky Democratic Party was very divided throughout this time. On the one hand, you had, you know, kind of the Happy Chandler faction that was a little bit more conservative and a little bit more lukewarm in its support of the New Deal. And Marie Turner was not a fan of Happy Chandler. You know, I don't know if I mentioned that or not. But by virtue of having these Democratic connections, we see Breathitt County, I think, at least from the period from the 30s till about 1970, we see Breathitt County getting more in terms of state and federal funding, certainly during the New Deal. And, you know, your question, you know, about comparisons to neighboring counties, I think Owsley County is a good comparison, which is right next door, and it has consistently ranked as among the poorest counties in the nation. It was heavily Republican, and John Birch has done a study of Owsley County and basically said that one of the reasons that Owsley County underperformed in comparison to Breathitt County was because families like the Turners had a political and economic monopoly that spread beyond Breathitt County into the neighboring counties. And so we see Breathitt County getting more in terms of federal funding during the New Deal. A similar thing would happen during the War on Poverty as well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Turners were Democrats when most of Eastern Kentucky was Republican.
I'd be very interested to see those numbers. That's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Our next question is from Melanie Goen.
Alan, I was wondering, have you tried to sort of map out or track land ownership and also then the connections to tax paying in Breathitt County with schools being locally funded? Very often school officials, that's one of the reasons people want that role, is because they control tax rates. But the tax base in a lot of Eastern Kentucky communities, because of absentee ownership, but also then when land starts to come into public hands, national forest lands, even the quicksand station in Breathitt County, owned by UK, then by the 1930s, sometime in the 1930s, that's not generating revenue for the schools. And so I wonder if you've kind of looked at that to think about some of the constraints that Marie Turner's facing when she's trying to build education in this region where you just don't have good funding for it, and how that then translates into her attempts to, both on a state level, federal support for education, to bring in funds from outside the county when possibly she realizes that there's not a lot of hope for generating the kind of revenue she would want to generate in the county, even if she was willing to do the hard thing and challenge norms that wanted to keep tax rates very low.
Yeah, you're right that this was a problem that she faced, and I haven't looked at individual tax or land records, so I can't give you a complete picture yet. But one of the things that she expressed some real frustration with was that the county would not tax itself adequately. And like you mentioned, a lot of these public lands, especially the Robinson Forest, which was a pretty large part of Breathitt County, wasn't generating much. And so one of the things that she was in favor of was a sales tax, which during the 1930s was a very prominent Kentucky issue. And this is where you can bring in Happy Chandler, who was running against the sales tax. And that's one of the reasons that she was not really buddying up with him. And it would take several decades to get that sales tax. And, like you mentioned, that, the amount of taxable land in Breathitt County was not much, and it was a poor county to begin with. So that made things harder. And, the county just was not willing to tax itself in these ways to support education. And she ran up against some of that. And even in later decades, when she's trying to drum up support for like bond issues to build courthouses or government structures, it took her a long time to finally get those passed. The county wouldn't vote for it until the 1960s. I mean, you had a courthouse that was falling apart literally for 30 years, and she was trying to get some of those things done, but she couldn't. And so that's where the federal support really comes in, whether it's from the New Deal or whether it's coming from Frankfurt or Washington. One of the great quotes that I think I included in the paper was, she said, "I was never afraid of federal control in Breathitt County. How else could we get the money?" So that was her outlook. Yeah. See, Dr. Newfont, I think I saw your hand.
This conversation just has me thinking, Alan, about this is taking me back to Joe's point earlier about the way she's really working this nexus between a fairly standard version of patronage politics that's happening, except that she's female, but like otherwise the little kingdoms metaphor works pretty well for what's going on in Breathitt County with the Turner family, as I understand it. But she's also got this nexus where she's leveraging New Deal dollars, and she's working both the patronage side and the New Deal. I guess a state level is also in there, but it seems like she's particularly adept at drawing in federal dollars and federal projects and presence and so on. And so that might be a way of framing this as I don't know how to put gender in there, and how to. I do think it's important that she's a woman that's doing this. I think that's a crucial part of this story, that she is working within gender norms, but also pushing the envelope on gendered norms at the same time. But I think that nexus between, like, that's really interesting to think about how she's using a very traditional patronage politics approach. But unlike my understanding of most Appalachian patronage politics, is pretty local. Maybe there's some state, they're mostly controlling local dollars though, and local votes, and they're really focusing on that. And there's I don't remember a lot of instances of people moving that up into these other levels of power, sometimes at the state level certainly, but I don't remember a lot of other instances at the federal level the way you've demonstrated happens here.
Yeah, and I think you're right that she was very good at kind of cohabiting these very different spheres, whether it was politics or whether it was education, and she's doing it on both the local, state, and federal levels. And I think that's one of the things that made her approaches so successsul. That if she went to the state and it didn't work out, she'd go to the federal level, or vice versa. And she was always trying to cultivate these connections, whether it was at the local, regional, or federal level. She was just good at politicking, I think, to put it simply. Full disclosure, the gender angle of this study and the opportunities for that is something that I'm working on improving the most. And I think that's something that definitely needs more fleshing and parsing out, to think about, how she is navigating these many different worlds, but also doing it as a woman. That's something that really, I think, demands more attention. So that's why I think this is a good example of a work in progress, that can go a long way.
Can I follow up on that observation, just strictly out of my own ignorance? How unusual is Marie Turner in being a woman who's exercising power and influence through local education in Kentucky at this time? And the reason I asked is that, I'm trained as a British historian, and maybe it was different in the U.S. I don't know, but local education became one of the first levers of power for women, and certainly in Britain. It was one of the first public offices that they were legally permitted to hold. And already by the turn of the century, you have women who are superintending, I guess, the British equivalent of local school districts, and so it's a more, in the context I'm familiar with, it's a more obvious conduit for women to exercise a kind of political influence. And I'm just wondering how unusual Marie, or not so unusual, Marie Turner is by dint of being a woman. I know that she exercises a great deal of influence, and I'm sure she's atypical from that perspective.
Yeah, I think when she took office in 1931, she was one of like 6 or 7 women superintendents in the state, and this varied across the country. I've read some places where women were being superintendents in places like New Mexico in like the 1890s. So there was an established pattern throughout the nation and throughout Kentucky, although to a lesser degree in Kentucky. But especially in the 1920s, after suffrage, and this is pulling from a book by Christy Anderson, she's saying that a lot of women used local politics as kind of their on point of entree into the political world, whether it was serving on, city councils or as, local committees or commissions. And then education, whether it was a superintendent or not, also becomes a point of entree for these women, because education was, still, viewed within that female sphere. So it was more socially acceptable, for women to exercise, I guess, power through education.
Alan, I was wondering if I could kind of follow up on these questions about the distinctiveness of Marie Turner's image and actions in terms of your source base, which seems really incredibly rich. And at the same time, part of the image, the self-made image, right, in terms of the representation in newspaper, which are naturally sort of favoring her position as kind of a local figure, and then her position in these oral history collections that you're drawing on. And you, in talking about her, the story is acknowledging this politicking, this exchange of give and take, but also downplaying it as detrimental to the locale or to her moral or character standing, right? And so I'm curious to what extent you feel that, the sources are sort of guiding you to that judgment. And, if there's kind of a source that you wish you could have in terms of revealing something about this story that's not there, or what reading against the grain you've had to do or would hope to do.
Yeah, and most of the sources that I've looked at, particularly newspapers, had pretty favorable views of her. She one of the things that she did was cultivate connections. This was after the 1930s, but she knew people at the Courier Journal in Louisville, which I use in this essay. But John Ed Pierce, who was a journalist that covered Eastern Kentucky, they would become intimate or close friends, and so you have to take that into consideration as well. And the oral history interviews that I've looked at, there's a handful of probably 3 or 4 dozen. And this is where you start to get these really radically differing opinions of her. Several people have commented that, in Breathitt County, either you loved the Turner family or you hated the Turner family. There wasn't much of an in-between. But more people were on the Turner family side because they needed jobs, and the Turner family was very good at delivering these kind of jobs and resources that people needed during the 30s and 40s. And so, on the other hand, there were people who, throughout their lives said that the Turner family was the worst thing that could ever happen to Breathitt County. And so we see all of these allegations of corruption and fraud and vote buying, and there's pretty good evidence that there was some vote buying going on throughout this time and into the 60s. But nothing ever came of that, I think in part due to the connections that the Turner family had created. And so kind of the frustrating thing about sources is that Marie Turner didn't leave, she didn't leave behind any papers or anything like that. We've got a couple hours of interviews that she gave, which don't really tell us much. So I've had to do these just kind of fragmentary scraps that I can get in the archives, which for the better part of the summer were closed and I couldn't even get to try and piece together what she was thinking. And I lost my train of thought, but it's clear that she was very interested in having this particular image of her. She was, especially in her later years, worried about her legacy. And she even got a couple of people to write books about her and her family's legacy. and apparently she wasn't pleased with the way they were depicting her or writing about her, and she scrapped them. And I haven't been able to trace down any of the manuscripts or interviews that people were doing with her. So that's something that I desperately wish I had.
Well, that sounds like it would be a pretty incredible find. So good luck. We probably have time for one or two more questions. We're running towards the end of our time here. Phil, did you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, just kind of. I just wanted to make a recommendation to Alan about not really a related reading, but I mean, she just sounds like a really interesting and colorful person, and a controversial person, and people have strong opinions about her one way or the other. In a way that I've just gotten through what Robert Caro has written about LBJ. It took me a long time to get through all that stuff. But I don't know if you've read the early volumes of Caro's LBJ biography, but I think the flavor of that might be something that helps you think about how you can make the most of this colorful, controversial person who trains as a teacher, right? Like LBJ, comes from this kind of controversial family like LBJ. And somebody who leverages local power local power in a really poor place in interesting ways that bring federal dollars, which he's doing even as a very young politico in the Hill Country. So it's just something I thought a little bit about as I was reading your paper. And if you haven't read it, it's fun to read, but you'll be jealous of all the people he was able to interview because so many people were still alive at that point.
Oh, thank you. You're right. It's, what is it, like 4 volumes now? And I think I've read parts of the second one. But no, thank you.
So, Alan, I'm wondering, can you speak at all to the question of like school segregation or anything like that in Breathitt County?
That's another part that has been frustrating for me. And so from what I can find, during the 1930s, there were 2 African-American schools in the county. The African-American population had decreased over time. And so it was, I think, less than 1% during the 1930s. And the only evidence I've been able to find, dealing with segregation or Marie Turner's attitudes towards race was in one interview she gave where she said that the schools were desegregated in the late 50s. So I think 3 or 4 years after the Brown decision. And the only thing she said was, yeah, we didn't have a problem with it. They were welcome. We didn't have a problem with it. And she seemed a little bit kind of anxious to get to the next question. So it kind of makes me wonder.
Yeah, that's a very typical white officials response to that question. And it's almost, I mean, if you interview anyone from the Black community, you're gonna get like a radically different take on that. But that's almost a trope of oral history. Ask a white person about, especially a white person in power, about school desegregation, they're going to say it was not a problem. Go ask a Black person who experienced the same thing, they're going to give you a completely different response. And that's very interesting. But like, do you know, was there before schools, like, do you know where the school, like, was there one Black school? Like, how did all that even work?
There were 2, and one was within the city limits of the county seat of Jackson. It was one of the Rosenwald schools that across Kentucky were fairly common, and the other one,
the Greater Appalachian region, they were very common.
Yeah, that's you're right. So they had a Rosenwald school, and then there was another very small one in a very rural part of the county. that I just haven't been able to find anything on hardly. So it's frustrating, and I'm still working on it. Yeah, and you know, another comment that the only other comment I can find that she made that had anything to do with race was, you know, she was talking about a relationship she had with a judge in Frankfurt, and she said she would go to his house frequently, and she said she just loved that. She loved the black servant that they had there, and she loved eating her food. That was all she said. So, you know, you can draw lots of conclusions from that, I think, but anything substantive, I'm still working.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, for sharing this with us and bringing us into the windows of a really complex character. And you know, yesterday, Alan and I were talking about the scheduling of this workshop, and he said maybe it was unfortunate, but I for one appreciated the chance to get away from the news headlines for an hour or so. And so thank you so much for sharing this with us, Alan.
And thank you all for coming, for reading, and you've given me lots of good food for thought. That I've made scribbles down here constantly, so I'll have to decipher them and think about them as I continue revising from now until January. But thank you all very much. And thank you for putting together the questions and adjudicating them, even if I gave some less than satisfactory answers on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Alan.
Bye, guys. Have a great weekend.
Bye, thank you.